can choose a better way. We can be a better people, and we can make a better world. Welcome to the Be In podcast, where our goal is to solve all the world's problems. You laugh, but think about it. People's actions follow from their emotions and attitudes. At the root of every single problem in the world, from conflict and climate change to workplace stress and road rage, are people acting out of fear, greed, and division. That is what we have to change. The Be In events are designed to do just that, to normalize understanding, love, and unity worldwide. You can find out more at www.be-in.life. I am your host, Jennifer Sullivan, and today we have the most incredible honor of welcoming Reverend Kevin Peterson. Reverend Peterson is a Boston-based activist whose work brings together faith, civic engagement, and public policy. The founder of the New Democracy Coalition, he is committed to advancing justice and fostering democratic principles through community organization, public speaking, and grassroots activism. His efforts focus on strengthening civic life and democracy, making him a vital voice in the ongoing dialogue about equity and public action in Boston and beyond. I can think of no better person for our first episode. Thank you so much for being here, Reverend Peterson.
Well, I'm glad to be here on your first episode. I'm honored.
I'm honored. So can you tell us first a little bit about your background and why you've chosen the path that you have?
I can go way back and talk about my childhood. Was raised in Philadelphia, was reared in Black church life, Black Pentecostal church, storefront church in Philadelphia, which eventually imbued me with values that I now live by and that I now work by. I left Philadelphia to come to Boston University decades ago. And at one point, I was a journalist writing for a local newspaper. I still do journalism, op-ed pieces from the Boston Herald and the Boston Globe and some other places, Commonwealth Magazine, Medium. But eventually found myself working in the area of civic engagement in the early 90s, doing voter registration within Boston's Black community and then across the state, and found myself working across the country, working around voter education and voter registration, landing at one point in Selma, Alabama, where I served on the board of the National Voting Rights Institute. Back in Boston, I continued work around civic engagement, founding an organization called Part of the Solution, which focused on voter engagement. And then eventually, over the last 15 years, I've been working in an organization I founded called the New Democracy Coalition, which focuses around civic literacy, civic policy, and electoral justice. So that's still in the area of voter engagement, but it stems out to issues particularly around civic literacy, where we believe that the more a person knows about the workings of democracy, the more likely they are to be engaged, not only on the electoral level in terms of voting, but also in terms of being involved in the community and community organ. The vision has expanded and the organization has now different components. The civic policy aspect of the organization of New Democracy Coalition focuses around legislation and around issues connected to policies around voting. So we work in the areas of redistricting, work in the areas of ensuring that election days are fair and equitable for everyone at the polls. You know, historically that there is inequity at the polls for whites versus blacks, just in terms of voter intimidation and the scouring of the voter list, where members of the Black community are taken off the list. So we area around civic policy and making sure that election days are fair for everyone. The work around civic literacy over the last 4 or 5 years has led us into the area of addressing issues of racial justice, racial inequity. Effort has sort of bled into our activities in the wake of the George Floyd lynching, I would say. So as we persist in the post-George Floyd era, we're working around taking down racist symbols in the city of Boston, changing the name of a historic building in Boston called Faneuil Hall. It was built by a person named Peter Faneuil, who was a slave owner. So we're working around the issues of race and reparations. We founded last year an organization called the Boston People's Reparations Commission, which is decidedly committed to grassroots activism around reparations, atonement, repair, reconciliation.
That is just some beautiful work. It's so nice to have people like you out there trying to fix things. All right. Our motto is be present, be peaceful, be powerful. Every episode in the Be In podcast focuses on one or more of the core values, and you can speak to all of them. So let's kind of start with peace. You've been deeply involved in advocating for racial justice and civic engagement in Boston. To put your work in context, I think we might need a short history lesson. Why is Boston considered one of the most racist, if not the racist cities in the US?
Well, Boston was founded along the lines of racial acrimony and racial division. Less than a decade, or a little more than a decade after Boston was founded in 1630, slaves came into the city and became an important part of the city's residents' exploitation around labor and around culture. So indigenous to the formation of the city, endemic to the formation of the city of Boston, is the scourge of racism, of racial acrimony, of racial hatred towards, at that time, Africans, and then eventually African Americans. So Boston was born in the cauldron of racism, and it's never left. We know that for some time, after nearly 100 years, slavery was abolished in Massachusetts. It was the first colony to adopt slavery, by the way, but after nearly 100 years, it was abolished. Yet the scourge of racism systemically and in terms of the moral culture in Boston, it persists even up into 2024. So we have issues around disparate racial statistics between Blacks and whites in Boston in 2024 as it relates to health indices. If you live in Boston and you're Black, you're likely to die 20 years earlier than the average white person in Boston. That has to do with the inequitable healthcare system that cuts along the lines of race. According to a Federal Reserve study, the average net worth of a Black family in Boston is $8 compared to $250,000 for the average white family in the city of Boston. You're less likely to graduate from high school as a Black person, public high school as a Black person. You're less likely to graduate than your white counterpart. Income is disparate in terms of net worth, but in terms of what a white person makes yearly as a salary compared to a Black person, there's vast differences along those lines also. So even in 2024, we still see the legacy of slavery and hatred and systematic racism in the city of Boston that has been directed towards Africans initially and then Black Bostonians over centuries.
Can you give an example? Just because I know that people watching this, some of the people aren't going to understand systemic, like what that means, systemic racism. Can you give an example of how that happens and what
Yes,
that is?
yes, systemic racism on two levels. It reflects laws and statutes that have been put in place that discriminate against Blacks in Boston. The public schools in Boston were segregated at one point, not only by law, but by custom, by mores, so to speak. That's a form of systemic racism. When a Black is not allowed to apply for and receive a public service job within the public facilities, within the public sphere, that's discrimination. That reflects systemic racism. When statues or buildings are named after Confederate soldiers or people who were slaveholders in the city of Boston, that reflects systemic racism. And all those systems in some ways conspire to demean and in some ways destroy the livelihood of Black Bostonians. So it is a combination of efforts that reflect laws and behavior that reflects this systemic racism. And part of our effort in recent years, part of my effort has been to work with other community organizers, faith-based leaders to address the issues of longstanding systemic racism in the city of Boston, so as to be a model in some ways to other communities across the country.
That's just so beautiful. I could have an entire conversation. I kind of want to have an entire conversation around that so we could educate more people. To change things, we have to come together and unite. How can the broader community support these efforts of addressing systemic issues?
Well, I think the broader community, if we're talking about the Black community and the white community, they need to continue, each community needs to continue to educate itself, the members of those respective communities, need to educate themselves about the history of systemic racism in Boston. Believe it or not, many Bostonians do not believe that there were slaves in the city of Boston because Bostonians considered the cradle of liberty and considered where democracy was born. Technically, it was Philadelphia, I think. But people think of Boston as extremely liberal and as having a history where where democracy was embedded and where democracy flourished. To a certain extent, that is true. But to a certain extent, we do not know, or we've hidden from the facts that Boston, that Massachusetts was created, the great wealth and the great culture that's now reflected, has its foundations in racism. So it's important for the respective communities, Black and white, to educate themselves about the history that's happened here. Because if we don't know the history, we can have no real reckoning. We can have no apology. We can have no atonement. We can have no repair. We can have no reconciliation if we don't know the history. So part of our efforts, particularly around the Faneuil Hall Peace and Reconciliation Project, is to use Faneuil Hall and Peter Faneuil, whom the building is named after, as proxy for educating not only the Black community, but the white community about the history of racism, of slavery in the city of Boston. We use them as an example. Peter Faneuil and Faneuil Hall, they're metaphors around how we might better understand our history. Once we get to better understanding our history, we come to a point where we can grapple with who we are historically, how we're connected with historical racism, how it is part of the city's culture and character. Once we get to that point, we can struggle, we can grapple, we can engage in the challenges around becoming a truly multiracial democracy. That's the point, a multiracial democracy where we accept each other, notwithstanding colors, creed, or background, and move into a society in Boston where we share in its resources, we share in the culture, we share in mutual love and affection for each other, and we create the peace that you're promoting on this podcast.
I just love all the different efforts going into this. I think education is so important. I mean, for exactly the reason that you just said, people have to understand what happened and how it's affecting things today, like exactly why is this law like this and why is it racist? You know what I mean? Because a lot of people don't get it. But you've called for Boston to confront a lot of its historical injustices. What role does reconciliation play in building a united community, and what practical steps can we take towards that?
When we talk about how the vision of this country, which is grand and which is beautiful, around creating a democracy, my faith background uses a different word for democracy. It uses the word beloved community. Beloved community means, in my mind, is very similar to how we talk about democracy, where we share in our commonality. We share the commonwealth. We share a common culture, as diverse as it can be. It's important that we strive towards that. It is the goal of community to a certain extent. Boston is a rich community in many, many ways, but it has not resolved the issue around race. And what we need to get to ultimately, Jennifer, is find the posture or position of reconciliation that ushers in the beloved community, which is the same as existing within a multicultural democracy, where my cultural styles are equal to the cultural and political and civic styles as others, and vice versa. So that's where we want to go, and I think it's achievable. We are a better country, in some ways, a better culture in Boston than we were 50 years ago. I still have deep concerns about where we are now. You know, we're one of the most segregated cities of the larger cities in the country. We're one of the most segregated. And I mentioned the other statistics earlier. So there are deep, deep problems for the civic life in Boston about which we must continue to push towards that beloved community, a true multicultural democracy. It is problematic that Blacks in this city consider them part, but also no part of the city. That's an existential crisis. That's almost like living a social death when a portion of the city that lends otherwise to the vibrancy of the city is considered a part, but no part. Is segregated, is rejected, is seen as something other. That reflects a crisis within the personality, a kind of schizophrenia within Boston's culture. So that needs to be addressed. It won't happen overnight. It'll take some time. Like I said, I think we're a better city than we were 50 years ago along the lines of race, but there's still deep problems that hamper our culture more generally.
Something interesting you just said, and I for the sake of education, Boston is one of the most segregated cities. Obviously, there are no like signs, blacks can only here and whites only here, but
I'll give
so
examples.
yeah.
It's neighborhoods. There are specific neighborhoods in Boston where only Blacks live, and there happens to be deep poverty. There are neighborhoods in Boston where 95% of the people are white, and there's abundance and there's wealth. That reflects a system of housing segregation, which was intensified in the 60s and the 70s through what was called redlining, where realtors created Black communities by scaring white people out of places in Dorchester and Mattapan, and Blacks moved in. And those areas became neighborhoods where there was intense poverty and lack of opportunity. Those neighborhoods still persist in Mattapan and Dorchester, to a certain extent, Roxbury, and now in a neighborhood called Hyde Park. Those are where Blacks live for the most part. And that reflects segregation and discrimination policies around housing. You look at the Boston public schools, where a disproportionate number of Blacks and Latinos, we Blacks and Latinos make up about 40% of the population. We're about close to 80% of the Boston public school population. That's segregation. The system have left the school system to Blacks and Latinos, where there is poor education being meted out within our public schools, and high dropout rates, or disproportionate dropout rates, I should say, among Blacks. So the segregation is reflected only if we look at those two categories.
What's the biggest challenge that you've faced uniting everybody, and how have you addressed them?
Well, the challenge has been engaging Blacks and whites in dialogue. In Boston, there's a deep cynicism within our culture, our civic culture, around addressing the issue of race. We see it, we certainly feel it. It haunts some of us. Others enjoy the what they reap from the exploitation and segregation and racism. They enjoy money that may come out of that, the pleasure of living in affluent neighborhoods. We see it; it's all around us, but we are in some ways cynical and some ways very reluctant,
Mm-hmm.
Jennifer, to have the conversations about where we are. We avoid speaking to the truth of the matter, although we see it every day. So part of my challenge and the challenge of other activists around reparations, for example, has been to engage our fellow Bostonians, for example, in frank, candid conversations that has a visceral effect, where you feel it in your gut, having that dialogue, breaking through that cynicism and through that disinterest and having those conversations has been the most challenging things.
Mm.
And so over the years, we've had mock slave auctions. We've chained ourselves to Faneuil Hall, for example. We've participated in sit-ins at the mayor's office, Mayor Wu's office. Some of us have been arrested. That is part of a public education process. Provocative, it's performative, but it's our attempt to sort of break through the barrier, so to speak, that prevents us to engage each other in real difficult testing conversation around race. There's no other way to get to this issue around reconciliation as the end game. We don't get to reconciliation without getting to reparations and without acknowledgement around systems of racism and interpersonal racism. We don't get to that without having that dialogue. So breaking through the existing curtains, so to speak, or the existing walls that don't allow the dialogue is very, very challenging, but it's very, very important. And if we don't break through those walls, then we don't get to where we need to get to as the founding fathers envisioned, as Dr. King, who I consider among the founding fathers, a modern founding father. He envisioned the beloved community also. John Lewis, Fannie Lou Hamer, Rosa Parks, their founding fathers and mothers who rose up in the 1950s and the 60s, helped complete the vision, the dream of those original founding fathers. And if we don't have the complementary vision and dreams of folks like Rosa Parks and Fannie Lou Hamer and Dr. King and Dr. Ralph Abernathy and Reverend Jesse Jackson, we don't incorporate their vision and the visions of millions of civil rights workers and millions of people, perhaps like me. We don't incorporate those visions into the original, then we won't get to where we need to get to. So the nation is approaching its 250th birthday. We know that this has been a long period of engagement in terms of dealing with the issue of race. Anti-Black racism is among the country's original sins. I think you've heard that. So it's been a long, protracted struggle through slavery and through the Reconstruction period, and then through periods where we saw the emergence of first civil rights movements in the 20s and the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, and even up until the election of our first Black president, Barack Obama. That is a part of the long legacy, I believe, of engaging in the dialogue around race. It's about confronting the old symbols, the old racist tropes in our nation over a period of time where we finally get to the place of having more constructive conversations and creating a better way. I had the wonderful opportunity to visit the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. Not too long ago. And it so very much reflects how the image, the culture, the history of Black people in this nation has in some ways been integrated into the national narrative in terms of belonging, in terms of moving towards that beloved community. So in some ways, I'm very optimistic in terms of where we are moving as a nation. And that museum is an example of it. There in the nation's capital for all to see the contributions of a race which at the beginning of the nation was denied a status of humanity, considered talking work animals, slaves. To see that expression of Black culture installed in the nation's capital, it's something to be joyous about, notwithstanding so much more work we need to do. Looking forward to having the first female Black president pretty soon. So as we persist in Boston, there are national examples we can cling on to that could give us hope to move forward.
You were talking about how people just don't want to have these conversations.
Yeah.
And I mean, personally, I know that it makes me really uncomfortable. You know what I mean? Because you feel guilty, you just feel horrible about what happened. And it's so difficult not to admit it, but like you don't want that to have happened. So you don't want to
Yeah.
talk about it. You know what I mean? But it needs to happen. And how can we start having those conversations more widely? And what do you think are the most important things to say?
Well, it requires courage. It requires Black people and white people stepping out of their comfort zone and believing enough in themselves and in the nation, and believing enough in the future for their children in terms of there being a better future, to sacrifice and be courageous in the name of democracy, in the name of a multiracial democracy, in the name of our forefathers, white and foremothers, white and Black, who have stepped to the fore to say that we need to make a better Boston around the lines of race. We need to make a better nation along the lines of race. That's the most important thing. And everyone won't arrive to that position of courage. It will take almost a minority of people in the white community and the Black community to engage in this leadership that brings the culture along, that brings the city's culture along. I'm mindful of the statistic, even within the Black community during the civil rights movement, less than 10% of Blacks participated in the civil rights movement with Dr. King and others. It was a minority who had the courage, the moral fortitude to step into those winds of racism, to step into the reality of systematic racism, Jim Crowism, all that sort of stuff, to break down those walls. So everyone will not join, Jennifer, everyone will not join this movement towards peace and reconciliation at one time. But if we can get creating a different vision for the city of Boston along the lines of race, then that's a good thing. And, I see that starting to develop, even within some white enclaves in the city of Boston. They're working on the issues of reparation. I'm happy to say that not too long from now, I'll be joining a collective of white churches who are reflective of colonial churches in the city of Boston, who owned slaves, or slaves were in their congregations sitting in segregated areas. Those colonial churches, King's Chapel and Old South Church and Trinity Church, are connected with the long legacy. Those churches right now are beginning a process of atonement. I'm happy to say that in the near future, I'm going to be attending an atonement service where those white churches are saying we're sorry for our participation in enslaving Black people. And we're sorry that we segregated Blacks during the church hour, during church services. And they're going to say, we're sorry that we have some slaves buried in crypts in the basements of our church. They're going to say they're sorry about that. So it's something, and they're going to move towards reparation. There is a movement where some of these white colonial churches connected to the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade, are gathering money, up to $50 million, to pay reparations to the Black community in the city of Boston. These are our white churches. So I'm happy that there is some movement. I'm happy to provide some leadership in that area with New Democracy Coalition and the Boston People's Reparations Commission. We're working closely with these white churches. So there are some who are stepping to the fore to say, we're going to be courageous and we're going to engage this beautiful vision of the beloved community that Dr. King spoke about, to bring to Boston something new so that we find ourselves living equitably and in common in the city of Boston.
This coming event is Be in Joy, but maybe we can have a Be in Knowledge at some point. We sit down with people and just educate them. That would be really cool. So, oh, there's so much. I don't want to keep you too long, but there's so much to talk about.
Yeah.
So if there's one thing, like we were saying, it's really uncomfortable for a lot of people to discuss this, but they need to know. What is the top one or two things that you would say to people, like, as far as this is what happened and this is why it matters?
Well, again, I would bring up the issue of slavery in the city. And I would bring up the issue, as uncomfortable as some might feel about it, as I'm talking to white people in the city, that they profit from a city which is deeply racist. And to the extent that they profit from it, they are wittingly or unwittingly racist. To the extent that they profit, they persist, they engage in the larger, broader culture of the city of Boston, they're racist. And it is reflected in microaggression, sure, but it also is reflected in policy. It's reflected in the politicians that they elect. And I think if they're confronted with that in different ways, from different perspectives, so to speak, using different strategies of confrontation, then they'll realize the extent of their racism, begin to think about how they can be better, how the city can be better.
I think a lot of people want to know how they can be better, and they just don't know how to do it.
Mm-hmm.
So educating themselves, but then coming to an organization like yours and participating, right?
Yeah, it doesn't get done without dialogue and confrontation. Racism would dissolve itself from the average white person in Boston without, osmotically, without any encounter in terms of conversation or even study. A white person can look at statistics that abound around racial division in the city and come to a deeper knowledge, come to an understanding, and come to a position of wanting to change. Some of them just want to look at the composition of the city and the realities of the city with regard to race and racism. So there are different ways to come to it. I think the better way to come to it is through interpersonal engagement. I think white people, black people need to talk to white people around racism in Boston, and that's going to allow us to get a little better, I think. I mean, I think, Jennifer, 4 years ago when we started the name change effort around Faneuil Hall, 90% of Bostonians said, no, don't change the name of Faneuil Hall. We engaged in all kinds of public education performances. White people started to get it. They were being confronted. The city, with the history of Peter Faneuil and the history of that edifice downtown Boston. And now a majority of Bostonians, white and black, support the name change of Faneuil Hall. A majority, according to a Mass Inc. poll. This is a serious polling company in the city of Boston, Massachusetts. A majority of Bostonians say change the name because it doesn't reflect who we are and who we should be. That's progress. And that comes through confrontation and conversation and dialogue, hitting the issue of racism flat on the head and having some conversation about how we can get better. Progress, little by little, but it takes that confrontation. It takes encounter around the issue in order to make some improvements.
Frequent encounters. Like, let's normalize an uncomfortable conversation. Let's just say, okay, yes, this is uncomfortable for me to talk about, but it needs to be talked about. And then just have the conversation.
Yeah. Race and racism is not taught particularly race and racism in terms of Boston, not toward our public school, not
Right.
toward a systematic way in our public institutions.
I could go on and on and on.
Yeah,
Um, like we could have like an entire day of conversation here. But I'm going to, maybe you can come back and we can have more dialogue about this.
yeah,
But I don't want to keep you too long. So thank you so much for being with us and giving us your insights and intelligence and knowledge. Thank you.
thank you very much.
So be present, be peaceful, be powerful. This has been the Be In podcast. I want you all to know that Be Enjoy Boston is coming up quickly. It's November 2nd from noon to 4 on the Boston Common adjacent to the Visitors Center. We are creating a little pocket of the world in which we all want to live. And then when people leave, there's a ripple effect. And by holding these events regularly in cities across the globe, we can create consistent opportunities for people to experience and practice kindness, understanding, and connection. This regular exposure to positive interactions will help shift individual attitudes and behaviors. As more people participate, it builds a collective momentum, challenging the prevailing norms of fear and division. And over time, this is going to create a cultural shift where empathy and unity become familiar and accepted and influence how communities engage and how societies operate. So you can go to www.be-in.life and find out more about us. We are in need of support, both for volunteers and financially. So if you can and you want to, go to the website and donate. But you can also find a list of skilled volunteers that we need. But no matter what, whatever it is, we really hope to see you on the Common on November 2nd. Join the evolution.